this workshop. So yeah, hi, I'm Lauren. I'm a student organizer with DePaul University and with Kappa, and I'll be helping with tech today. I wanted to welcome you all to this workshop, Education, Not Militarization, Defend Indigenous Schools in the Philippines. Today we'll be hearing from Malaya, Chicago and the Chicago Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines. I'm going to pass the mic off to them and let them take it from here.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. So I was thinking maybe we could do just a little bit of introductions. So if folks could share their name, the organization that they're a part of, if you're a part of an organization, and what do you know about the human rights situation in the Philippines? So I guess I could start actually. So my name is Mai. I'm part of Malaya, Chicago. What I know about the Philippine human rights situation is one of the really intense data points that there are is that there's an estimated 30,000 people who have been killed under Duterte's administration. Yeah, so who would like to go next?
I can go next. Yeah, I'm Lauren. Again, I told you guys a little bit about myself. My pronouns are she, her. I know a little bit about the current human rights situation just from some cursory research before I came to this workshop, but I'm also familiar with the very protracted history of imperialism and the asymmetrical relations that the Philippines has been engaged with other global powers in the last century and beyond. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation.
Hello, yeah, I'm Richard Giovanoni. I live in Morton Grove, Illinois. I don't know a whole lot about the Philippines. I know something a little about William Pomeroy wrote about when the Hucks were fighting there. That's back in the 1940s. And, obviously the stuff with the Marcos and things like that, but I'm not that, since I think they closed, what was it, the Clark base they used to have in, what was the base they closed, some big base we had there in the Philippines a number of years ago, but since that time I haven't paid too close attention to what's been going on in the Philippines, so I'm mostly here to learn.
Wow, it sounds like you all actually know a lot, but I'll pass it to Bev to close us off for the check-in.
Yeah, my name's Bev. I'm with the Chicago Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines. And yeah, I think definitely it's, what I know is that the American public really doesn't know much about what's going on in the Philippines and how their taxpayer dollars are helping to fund a lot of these human rights abuses that are so similar to what's going on in the struggles with Palestine and many countries across the globe. So very glad to have you all join us in our workshop today.
Yeah, awesome. So we'll just, if you can present.
Yes. Make sure I'm on present here.
Are you all able to see that?
Oh, not yet.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. So yeah, so we're here to discuss education, not militarization, defending Indigenous schools in the Philippines. And so we're specifically going to be talking about the Lumad people who are in southern Mindanao. And so we'll give you kind of a briefer on the Lumad people as well. But I think it would be good if we could watch this short video that talks a little bit about the Lumad schools.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Since we're so small.
Importante ang edukasyon tungod kay isip usa ka estudyante kinahanglan jud namo maedukar aron mahibal-an pud namo kung unsa bisan gani sa kuan kanang pagbasa, pag-ihap ug pagsulat mao man jud na importante kay aron pud makabalo mi ug makakaton mi ug masaysay pud namo ni sa ubang sa among sumusunod ug sa matudlo pud namo sa among mga kaubanan sa among komunidad.
pinaka-importante sa among komunidad ang eskwelahan tungod kay dito sa among komunidad dito nakapuyo ang mga tigulang nga wala gyud sila naka-eskwela. Mao nga kami nga mga kaapu-apuhan o kaanak-anakan kami nakigbisog aron alang sa pag-eskwela aron kami makakat-on sa maayong pagsuporta puhon sa among mga kaparintihan na sumusunod nga mga bata.
Ako ang giganahan o gigugma jud sa among eskwelahan kay kini mitudlo sa amo dili lang sa akademya kundi kabahin pud sa agrikultura o sa panglawas ug kini nagmulat sa among mga mata kung unsa jud ang tinuod na nagapanghitabo sa ato ang katilingban.
Para pud sa ako gihigog man jud ako ang kanang eskwelahan jud kay tungod kay diha ko naka-cut-on og daghang makat-unan ako sa pangtradisyonal sa amo ang katutubo nga kanang katigtugulangan pa namo ug kanang panghitabo pod nga nahitabo diri sa ato ang nasod ug kanang murag diha ko nakabalog yun nakabaton nakamatngon nga ani ang dapat buhaton og isip usa ka kanang eskwelahan mao gyud ni ang dapat buhaton sa para makatabang po sa ato.
So that was just a brief video to give you a little sense of who the Lumad are, and we're going to show you another one just to give a little bit more background, but just so you all are a little bit more familiar with our two organizations today. CCHIRP is a grassroots organization of Filipinos and non-Filipinos who are working in solidarity to support genuine democracy and just and lasting peace in the Philippines. And Malaya Chicago is part of a national movement that's a broad movement of individuals, organizations, and various formations united under the common objectives of defending human rights, democracy, and sovereignty in the Philippines. And so, and welcome to James too. So I saw that you kind of hopped in and out. Hopefully your audio is okay and can hear us.
Okay.
Hi. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick? Because we did get a chance to go around. And if you'd like to say anything about what you might know about the human rights situation in the Philippines, and if you're part of an organization, that would be great.
I'm James Gibbs. I'm a CAPA member. I spend most of my time with the CAPA Climate Group, but of course I'm interested in the peace work that CAPA is doing too, and I support it. I joined this breakout because, I don't know, I just have an interest in the what's going on in the Philippines. It's such an important place. I know I don't have any special connection, but I know a lot of people from the Philippines. I'm interested in democracy in places like the Philippines where it is being so threatened by the leadership of the country.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you so much, James, for joining us as well. So we're going to give a very brief background of the Philippines. Of course, this is a short breakout session, so we're just going to cover just a few small details for you to take away. But here we see where the Philippines is located in Southeast Asia, very close proximity to China, Vietnam, Malaysia. And it's a very diverse and resource-rich country. So there are more than 150 languages as well as dialects spoken here. And about 15% of the Philippine population are indigenous peoples. And so the Lumad is actually a term. It's a Cebuano is one of the Philippine dialects, and this means native of the land. And so it refers to the 18 of the non-Muslim indigenous ethno-linguistic groups that are found throughout the island of Mindanao in the Philippines, which is the southernmost island of the Philippines. So we're gonna go over to another clip, and let me stop and share again this video here, so you can hear directly from the Lumad themselves. Welcome, Marcia.
Hello.
We're going to be showing a quick clip about the Lumad, the indigenous people in Mindanao, the southern island of the Philippines, and then we can get your introduction as well, okay?
Pinaka importante ang pantaron para sa amoa tungod kay ang pantaron mao nay among giisip isip among ginikanan sa tribo kay diha nagagikan ang amoang panginabuhian, diha nagikan ang among mga tubig, mga katubigan. Kung mawala na siya, kami posible mawala pud mi tungod kay mawala na ang among ginikanan.
Kining pantaron maumay sa tibok Mindanao, maukuno kini ang kasing-kasing sa Mindanao. Mao na ang ginatawag namo sa mga katigulangan sa una nga palengkihan, pangisdaan namo ang katubigan. Bananglitan kung mosulod ang mga kapitalista sa amo ang teritoryo, dako ang mahimong kadaot sa amo ang komunidad kanang sa tubig, bumubaha ng lubog ug naanay mga kemikal. Manay hugot yun namo nga panawagan nga dili yun mi magpasulod sa kini ang laging pipila lamang ang makabenepisyo ug dili para sa tanan. Wala na kuno'y gutom matud pa ni Mayor sa dato pa si Mayor Libayaw. Niya makatanom kay na may alson, makatrabaho na ang mga tao, wala na bation nga gutom. Tungod niadto nahitabo nga pagsulod sa alson diri sa amo ang komunidad, nakita namo nga ultimo ang amo ang luna isprayan na sa kuan kanang kamutian namo, isprayan na unya murag kanang wala nay kanang mabilin, dili na mosugot sila mo bilin og kuan kay unsaon pa man daw namo ang yuta nga mo trabaho na sildo. Diha nagsugod among pakigbisog sa pagdepensa sa amo ang yutang kabilin.
Sa katigulangan pa, nag-ingon ang katigulangan nga, kamong anak, ayaw pa eskwela sa inyong anak, kay ipakaon mo sa iganti. Mauna nga dugay, taas nga panahon, wala mi ta edukal tungod sa nakasubay mi sa iyang kanang tugon sa katigulangan nga ipakaon sa igante. Antod nga nakahunaw na mi nga kaming mga lumad mauna na ilugan mi sa yutang kabilin na adto mi kabukilan tungod sa kaning kapatagan. Gamay na ang gipakambyo sa pabaylo sa usa ka itarya, usa ka tinapa. Na usa pud ka bilog ang tabako. Mauna ka na murag naning kamot ni ang natugibang sa edukasyon so para kamao mi sulat, kamao basa.
Ang edukasyon dako ni siya gikatabang sa pagdepensa sa yutang kabilin kana tungod kay ang mga lumad o kapareho na ko nga lumad nakabalo sila kung unsaon pagdepensa or unsay mga hinungdan kung nganong depensahan ang yutang kabilin. So pinaagi sa edukasyon ang mga lumad makabalo na silang magsulat o magbasa, magkwenta or mailhan pod nila ang ilahang mga katungod isip lumad dinhi sa talaingod. Makuha nila kung angay bagyod nga magbarog sila sa ilahang yutang kabilin. Nga dili angay malapas sa mga tao nga magpahimulos ug mandaog-daog sa mga tribong lumad.
Okay. Well, thank you for Marcia for joining us in our breakout room too. So just wanted to give you a quick chance to introduce yourself as well. If you want to say your name and organization and what you know about the Philippines before we get into a little bit more about the Philippines.
Wonderful. Well, whenever I go to a peace conference, I try to find the breakout that has something that I know very little about. You know, the first peace conference that we had a couple of years ago before COVID interrupted, I went to the one on South and Central America because I was woefully uninformed about that area. So I decided this time I would come and hear what you guys have to say. In addition to working with CAPA, I'm also part of CCAWR, Chicago Committee Against War and Racism. So I wear two hats, but today my CAPA hat is on.
Great, thank you so much for joining us as well. Yeah, we'll fill you in a little bit more about what's going on in the Philippines so that you have a general sense of why the US is so interested also in this country. And so jumping right back into it, the Philippines actually is, as we mentioned, very resource rich. And so it has this is like the ranking in the world of their mineral production. And so the Philippines is 5th in the world in nickel, 4th in the world in copper, and 3rd in the world in terms of gold. Oh, am I sharing screen? No. Okay, there we go. Thank you. You're like, what are we looking at? Okay, got it here. So as you can see from the video, the Lumad were really talking about like how these different multinational corporations have really been trying to pursue their lands because of the rich mineral resources below their soil, as well as the logs, logging companies coming in to take their trees as well. So these communities have really been repressed in many ways. And so these communities have been able to set up schools for their children to really understand how and why they need to defend their ancestral lands. And so that's one of the reasons why CCHIRP as well as Malaya have really been focusing on the Lumad schools because of our important role and contribution here in the US of being able to highlight and support these schools and support their education. And so these Lumad schools, as you can see here, 9 out of 10 Lumad children have no access to education. And this is because they're in far-flung communities, and so the government tends to really neglect these communities unless they want something from them, right? And so these communities have been heavily militarized, and the Philippine government has been supporting these different corporations coming to take their lands. And so these Lumad schools are a form of resistance to the attacks on the Lumad people and communities, and really meet the needs of the people. So you can see here with the curriculum, it really focuses on community sustaining skills, preservation of their Lumad culture, and education of their human rights. So like in these communities, they really don't get the different type of health and social services that the government should be providing to them. So they learn how to do dental work, minor surgeries. They have a heavy emphasis on agriculture and organic farming in order to sustain their communities in healthy ways. And so we can see too that President Rodrigo Duterte, actually when he came into power, when he was the mayor before of one of the areas in the biggest city in Mindanao, he was actually very friendly to the Lumad. So he's kind of done this complete 180 turn. And you can see from this quote here, he says, "Leave, I'm telling those in the Lumad schools now, get out, I'll bomb you, I'll include your structures." And so we'll see in some of the next slides in terms of what the damage that he's done and the destruction that he's caused to these communities.
Yeah, so I guess just to say, unfortunately, Duterte really kept his promise of bombing Indigenous schools and lands. This has been something that's ongoing. You know, when I was integrating in Lumad schools, they would tell me that the students have a lot of consciousness of when there are planes flying above, you know, flying above their schools, because they know that there could be potential bombings. And so, you know, these are just some of the attacks that have been faced since Duterte took office. So, you know, it shares that there's been 13 students, parents, and education advocates who have become victims of extrajudicial killings. 54 have been charged with trumped up charges of, like, oftentimes they have these very fake charges just in order to arrest someone. So they might say, oh, you're kidnapping people, oh, you're committing arson, when in reality, they're really targeting human rights advocates, they're really targeting teachers and parents. There's been 48 incidents of military occupation of schools and communities. One of the schools that I integrated in actually had 54 armed forces of the Philippines occupying their school and preventing the classroom from functioning. There's been 19 Lumad schools that have been completely destroyed. What they often do is they'll send in these paramilitary forces or armed forces of the Philippines to literally tear the school apart as a way to demoralize the Lumad communities as well. 10 incidences of aerial bombing affecting 2,350 Indigenous people, and 178 Indigenous schools have been forcibly closed, with 5,579 students disenfranchised. I've actually heard that number has gone up since the time that this graphic was made. And so, you know, even during the pandemic, when people are struggling economically, there's been, you know, massive unemployment in the Philippines and just worsening economic crisis and poverty. These types of attacks continue, right? There's all these threats on Lumad communities. There's been what we call red tagging, terrorist tagging. They claim these schools are communist schools just because Lumad are protecting their rights to the ancestral lands. There's been school closures, military occupations, trumped up charges, and interrogations. And one of the most, you know, most impactful cases of that we'll talk a little bit more about after this slide. But this is just a visual aid to kind of give you an idea of the Lumad schools. So you can see in the left picture, that's a map of Mindanao. And those are some of the school locations that existed throughout the island. And on the right, you see the locations of what we call evacuate or evacuation schools. So because of all of these school closures, the Lumad communities have had to evacuate oftentimes to the cities. And in the place, they're basically in 3 different locations. There's Luzon, which is the top star. They have one in Manila with a lot of the universities of the Philippines. That's where you'll find them. In the Visayas, which is the center islands, you'll see them in Cebu. And then in Mindanao, they're in Davao. So essentially, they've had to evacuate in order to protect their schools, right? In order to maintain their education. But they also see this as an act of resistance, right? That they're able to continue their education even in these dire times, even as the military continues to harass them. And to kind of talk about how this relates to us, right? You know, the Philippines is halfway across the world, but truly the US government is supporting this dictatorship. It's supporting the closure of these schools and is funding it, literally funding it. So 550 million US tax dollars since 2016 have funded the displacement, school closures, and terrorist tagging and killings of Lumad communities. And so it's our demand as Malaya and CCHIRP to really cut US military aid to the Philippines and demand the Philippine Human Rights Act. We'll talk more about the Philippine Human Rights Act in a little bit and the ways that you can support that as well. So even though, you know, we're seeing a lot of really like hard situations in Lumad communities, the reality is their spirit is still really high. They're still really continuing to resist despite all of the attacks on their communities. You'll always see Lumad communities at the forefront of protests, of marches, really demanding their right to their ancestral domains and connecting their struggle to the struggle of liberation of the entire Philippines, right? And actually fighting for sovereignty and true democracy in our country. And as people in the United States, it's really our responsibility to fight alongside them, right? To show our solidarity, to connect our struggles here and the struggles of peoples around the world to really fight for liberation in the Philippines. So this is a space where you could really learn more about the situation in the Philippines. So we work closely with the Save Our Schools network in the Philippines. That is doing really great work to advocate for the rights of the Lumad people. Definitely encourage folks to check out their page there. Yes. Okay. So what are some ways that we can take action together, right? So one thing you can do is join an organization. You can join an organization like the Chicago Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines. You can also join up with some of our campaign machineries that we'll talk about in a little bit. You can also join our Save Our Schools campaign. So feel free to email CCHIRP or Malaya. Yes, we will put some links in the chat to get more involved with this. You can donate directly to the Lumad communities on the ground. So donations would go towards, for instance, legal fees for some of the people who have become political prisoners under Duterte's regime. They could also go towards providing food and shelter for the Lumad students, teachers, and community members that are seeking evacuation, right? It could also go towards, you know, helping sustain the schools, right? They still need materials, they still need resources in order to make those schools function. So we encourage folks, if you're able to, you can donate via CCHIRP on Venmo. We also have a PayPal link if you search up Anak Bayan Chicago. That's one way that you could donate directly to these Lumad communities, and we'll make sure those get sent over to the folks back in the Philippines. Something that I would really, really encourage everyone to do is integrate into a Lumad school. I know we're in pandemic times. We're trying to make some virtual integrations happen. So if you'd like to learn more about their struggle and hear from them directly, that you can join some of those virtual integrations with us. But once it is safe to travel, we would love for folks to join us on those trips back to the Philippines and learn more in that way. Both Bev and I actually have integrated directly with Lumad communities, and I'd say it's really a life-changing experience and a way that you can kind of really see their day-to-day life and be a part of fighting alongside them. So something we're forming, we just actually had our first meeting of this, and I'd love to invite everyone here, but also, you know, anyone that you know who would be interested in this kind of work, is to join the Chicago for People's Rights in the Philippines network. This is a really loose network where you can pop in once in a while and like take on some action steps with us. You could also learn more about like the situation in the Philippines, what are the latest updates, and engage with us in like planning protests, you know, doing some advocacy work, legislative work, you know, taking part in the Save Our Schools campaign. So we're going to be hosting basically monthly meetings where individuals and organizations can engage in our campaign work. Okay. The other part that we would really love for folks to take part in is the fight for the Philippine Human Rights Act. So the Philippine Human Rights Act would suspend all US military aid to the Philippines until such a time that we actually see the human rights situation in the Philippines like radically change, right? There are certain conditions that we would need to see in order to actually see that change. And so some ways that you could support that is endorsing the Philippine Human Rights Act as an individual or organization. So in the link that Bev dropped in the chat, you can see some like endorsing areas. So we'd love your organizations. We'd love for you as individuals to sign on to this. You can also lobby your representatives and senators to support the introduction of the Philippine Human Rights Act or PHRA in the House and Senate. So we're really excited because we're hoping to see the PHRA introduced starting early next month. We have Representative Susan Wild, who's actually willing to start pushing for this by then. And we're working on finding a way to also introduce it into the Senate. And so we're really trying to get everybody on board. This is really a bipartisan issue, right? This is an issue that affects everyone and is just an issue of, do you believe in human rights or not, right? And so we're really hoping to start taking action on this together. So yeah, that's kind of what we've got for today. I would love to hear from you all about, I know some folks are typing in the chat, I didn't get to look at it yet. But I would love to hear like your reflections, the connections that you're drawing about the Lumad situation.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
You may have covered this, but who's funding these schools?
Yeah, so there's a lot of international partners. There's been a lot of different groups around the world who have kind of taken up this campaign to provide education for Lumad communities. I think there's a lot of churches that are involved actually. There's like Methodist churches who have helped fund the schools as well. I don't know if you have any other.
Yeah, some Catholic churches as well with the Rural Missionaries of the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of international, but also national support.
Definitely.
Is there any viable public education in Mindanao?
Yes, so there has been some public education efforts, but the reality is a lot of youth in the Philippines are really unable to get an education or access that education because of how sparse the schools are. So essentially, like the way I describe it a lot of times is for a lot of Filipino youth, what they have to do is like cross, you know, multiple mountains in order to see a school. Because that's how, you know, there's really a lot of communities in the far run like countryside, right? And so unfortunately, they're not prioritized for education. And then there's also another, there's another issue that's happening in the Philippines too, is that, you know, a lot of kids start working in the fields really early on. You could literally be 5 years old and you know, helping out in the fields, you know, and the reality is they don't get to be prioritized for education as well because they know that they have to work. So this is one thing that I think is really valuable about Lumad schools, as well as they integrate, right, the agricultural education as well into their education system. So you know, Lumad students are learning about how important it is to take care of the land, to farm. They use farming also as a way to teach about, you know, mathematics, science, those types of things. And so that's something that also you don't see as often in public education. And you also see like, it's really costly, you know, to buy books for your school. It's really expensive to, you know, buy the different materials that you need when a lot of communities are living on 25 cents a day. And so what's really amazing about the Lumad schools is they're completely free. You literally get housing, you get food, shelter, you know, and an education for free, even up to the college level. And they make it so that the resources that you use are very like sustainable and already within the community. Yeah. Sorry, that was a long answer.
But complete, that's good.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or reflections that folks would like to share?
I guess what's coming up, like for me, is how important it is just first and foremost, like support Indigenous communities, because like during this presentation, I was thinking back to, I think like, well, just more generally, like the years-long quarrel between like Mexico's president and like the Zapatistas and like the Indigenous community, because I think he was the president, AMLO, he was like trying to implement this this train project that would have displaced like a ton of communities. And so it just reminds me of the struggle between like, you know, the Zapatistas and like Chiapas and AMLO, and even seeing how you know, international ties like connect to this as well, like in terms of like the Philippines, seeing how like US military aid is contributing to like the destruction of these schools, even how US military aid to like Israel is contributing to the destruction of like Indigenous Palestinian communities. So I'm really happy you guys did this presentation because I think it's so important to make these connections.
Yeah, thank you so much. Those are really sharp connections. And I think, you know, we really have to see this in an international context and how this kind of situation, unfortunately, is happening around the world. And one thing I think is really cool is Lumad communities are also, and Filipino communities in general, you'll see them with like Free Palestine signs or like, you know, talking about the situation in Colombia, and really drawing those connections because they see the need for international solidarity. Yeah. Richard, did you want to share it all? I saw you've been putting really cool things in the chat.
Well,
I was just think I put the link in that that in this Nicaragua Against Empire, I know they have a section where they talk about rural schools and indigenous schools that the Sandinistas are you know, that someone that did this documentary video visited those, you know, so there's an element in there of that, because I know in the 1980s, the US tried to exploit the claiming that they were, you know, harming the indigenous people back in those days. So now they're obviously taking all the kind of steps they are to, you know, to keep the, you know, to work with them and as best they can, and putting resources and everything else into that.
Yeah. Did you
Lauren
want
said that because she's doing some kind of research on the Sandinista government. So I wanted to put that link in that she was asking for.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Welcome.
Really important information.
I have another question.
Oh, go ahead, James.
Is there any indication, anything going on in the Biden administration to put some pressure on the government, Duarte, and all the repression? I mean, is there any positive movement in our government position vis-a-vis what's going on in the Philippines?
Yeah, I would say that there's been more on like the representative level, older people in Chicago, you know, senators that have been speaking out against the human rights violations in the Philippines. So Jan Schakowsky actually recently held a press conference that was denouncing the anti-terror law in the Philippines. And so the anti-terror law basically has allowed for the Philippine government to loosen up what gets called like terrorism. So they can target anyone as a terrorist, even for making a Facebook post. You know, there were people who have been arrested for making Facebook posts, you know, and so it was really amazing to see Jan Schakowsky speak out against that and really partner with like the Malaya movement, the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, to denounce those things. I would say though that, you know, President Biden himself has had some, you know, semblance of human rights conversations on the Philippines, but there's also been some kind of militaristic moves in terms of, you know, the visiting forces agreement being continued. There's been, you know, different arms deals with the Philippines that have been continued. And so there's still, you know, there's still the aspect of US militarization in the Philippines and funding of these human rights violations, which is why we really want to put pressure on government as well, so that we actually see that change. And we want to see, you know, the US government, like, you know, President Biden, hold their promises in terms of fighting for human rights in other countries.
Yeah, and I would just, small addition, just to note too, that we know Biden is also trying to uphold the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Obama was pushing before. And we know, just like with NAFTA and such, that these are really free trade agreements in disguise that will really just like support the multinational corporations and really devastate the economies and the livelihoods of the people in the Philippines too. So
yeah, and I think that's the cool thing about I guess what we're trying to do is, like, we know that representatives, you know, government officials won't listen unless there's really a push by the people. If there's not a mass movement behind it, right, we really won't be able to see that change. And so, you know, back in 2019, pre-pandemic, we brought like 20 people to Dick Durbin's office and we're like, we need to talk to you about the Philippine human rights situation. And we need to continue doing that, right? We need to continue getting more and more people involved in this fight for the Philippine Human Rights Act, so that we actually can see that cut to the aid to the Philippines.
Did you get any positive response from Durbin's office there?
You know, it was for the most part positive. I think there was a little hesitancy still, but I think there's been a lot of gains in terms of a lot of representatives really being behind the Philippine Human Rights Act. And so we're really hoping that when it gets introduced that we can get more folks on board. Yeah.
You know, what about Duckworth? You know, she's not very responsive on a lot of our issues. However, she's Asian.
I know.
I wish that meant something.
I know.
That doesn't mean anything.
It hasn't so far.
Well,
no.
Because she has sort of come forward on this anti-Asian hate thing. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering why she wouldn't be a little more sympathetic with what's going on in the Philippines.
Yeah, I mean, we've contacted her before. We get a lot of generic responses. Okay, yeah, we're gonna wrap up soon. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you too for such a wonderful and important conversation. I want to say there will be a recorded version of this, so there will be a video version of this breakout room. If you guys would like to check it out after the Peace Summit is done, we'll have it online on our website. We'll also have videos from the other breakout rooms, so if there's one you wanted to see that you couldn't, you can also see that online. I'm going to post a link in the chat to rejoin the main session. Thank you, Marcia, for doing that. And we'll just have some closing remarks before we start our next one tomorrow. So yeah, I will wait here for you guys to join the main session and keep that link there. But yeah, I'll see you guys there. And again, thank you, Bev. And thank you, Mark, for such like an important conversation.
Thank you so
Great,
much.
thank
Really
you.
appreciate everyone's conversation.
And see you on the streets. See you in Chicago.
Bye.